I was a Pokémon kid. Shocker, I know. The first game I ever played was Fire Red, a hand-me-down from my older siblings who had both just got shiny new DS consoles and passed their Game Boy Advance games down to me. I was probably a touch young at the time, as evidenced by how often I got stuck, but that didn't hamper my enjoyment of the game at all. Whenever I got lost or couldn't work out how to progress, I'd restart and just go over from the beginning again. I played the first half of this game at least 20 times, changing starters, trying different teams, finding new areas. From there on, I was just head over heels in love with Pokémon. Anyone who is a Pokémon fan as a child knows how this series hijacks your mind. The world, the iconography, the battle systems, and yes, the designs. They forced their way into my brain and refused to leave. I had liked things before, Star Wars, Percy Jackson, Mario, but Pokémon was different. It was my first childhood obsession. It fascinated me completely. I wanted nothing more than to learn about these creatures and to live in this world. The regions felt like they were begging to be explored. They were filled with trainers, new Pokémon, and secrets for me to uncover. For me, it was one of the first times I had ever really engaged with an open-ended game world. One that you could just poke around in, that was interconnected, with secrets and optional content to explore. I loved every part about it. From the world itself, to the trainer designs, to the nonsense narrative. No fiction or fantasy had engrossed me in that way, and even still, it holds some small, precious part of my attention. I know this experience isn't unique. Pokémon is the highest grossing media franchise. I am one of millions of children who became obsessed with this series. But I found the question of why we all fell in love with Pokémon particularly interesting. I'd wager that most Pokémon fans are not otherwise turn-based RPG fans. Pokémon is not a mechanical game for me, personally. I like the mechanics, sure, but they're not why I play Pokémon. For a lot of games, you can zero in on what makes them fun. The expression of Mario's movement, the exploration of a Zelda game, but for Pokémon, I don't think that this is quite as simple. We like these games because we like Pokémon. The world, the designs, the idea of catching and befriending these creatures. Our attachment to Pokémon is not to any one specific thing, but rather a nebulous bundle of things that make us think of Pokémon. This makes it weirdly difficult to talk about the series, and it doesn't help that most of us have an intense nostalgic attachment to it. I need to acknowledge where I stand here. I am miles from objective when it comes to discussing Pokémon. But hey, we all are. There are no casual Pokémon fans. We all have opinions, and they are rarely entirely level-headed. This is pretty clearly shown in the discourse surrounding Pokémon. I don't know if you've noticed, but discussing Pokémon on the internet has become charged. Most discussion inevitably devolves into either vocal and harsh criticism of Game Freak, or unwavering support and devotion to the series. The second crowd, the ones who are still riding that sweet wave of Pokémon hype, are typically characterized as prisoners to nostalgia, unable to accept the balanced and level-headed criticisms of the more critical crowd. But I don't think this is entirely fair. I think that the disappointed cynicism of some Pokémon fans is as much a product of nostalgia as the unwavering devotion. Game Freak has been on the receiving end of some irrational vitriol, and I think we can all agree that Pokémon discourse has been pretty toxic from multiple angles. We are all slaves to nostalgia, but some of us are willing to check out and enjoy that escape, while others are driven by a frustration that these modern games cannot recapture the magic of our childhood. This will be my bizarre attempt to break down this whole discussion, to examine the current backlash against the Pokémon series and offer up my own diagnosis of exactly what I think is wrong with Pokémon. If you ask someone where things started to go wrong with Pokémon, you'll get a lot of different answers. But I think the core of the current backlash against the Pokémon series can be pretty clearly traced back to the announcement of Sword and Shield. This E3 press conference brought us some very disappointing graphics, and one now famous moment when it was announced that this game would not feature the national dex. For those who are not huge Pokémon fans, and only clicked on this video because it was long and they needed something to keep them company over breakfast, for a Pokémon game to keep the national dex means allowing for every single Pokémon to be kept within that game. At the point of Sword and Shield, this was around 1,000 Pokemon. This was a huge disappointment to some. And along with the subpar visuals and the fact that these games seemed like 3DS titles stretched out onto Switch hardware, this was one of the first times we saw fairly widespread backlash over the decisions made around Pokemon. While we all waited with bated breath for the fabled home console Pokemon game, we received what is at best a HD translation of the 3DS formula, and at worst a step back in terms of functionality and content. There are two big parts to this criticism. The first is the lack of ambition or innovation. People had seen Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey running on the Switch. They had seen the stunning visuals it was capable of, and amongst these major Nintendo series reinventions, such a simple approach was disappointing. Yes, there are flashes of experimentation with the wild area and raid battles, but these are quite small steps hampered by poor execution. There is no confidence in any part of this design. These features are tacked on, paired with a lukewarm narrative and subpar technical execution. The other big point of criticism with Sword and Shield is, of course, the removal of the national dex. Some people have caught and kept a full national dex, and that got a lot harder with this game. Even if you will never truly complete the national dex, I think there is something tantalizing about the fact that you could. I think that we can all understand how the idea of porting a steadily increasing number of Pokemon to each new game might be unsustainable. But when combined with the generally poor visual polish and the apparent asset reuse, this does feel like a much more disappointing decision. And yet, there are people who don't see anything seriously wrong here, who are happy to receive a new Pokemon game and find it a perfectly pleasant and serviceable entry in the series, who can acknowledge that things could be better, but still enjoy the game that they got. Because at their core, these games are ordinary Pokemon games. None of the complaints that I've previously listed stop some people from enjoying this simple creature collecting RPG. For some people, a safe, perhaps underbaked, new entry is actually all they want. People just want the new Pokemon game and are willing to ignore flaws as long as the core Pokemon loop is present. As I said before, Pokemon hijacks your brain. I don't think that conventional game design wisdom can fully explain the appeal of Pokemon. These games rely on such a childlike suspension of disbelief that they are hard to review clearly. Because no matter how bad a Pokemon game is, as long as it gets its core right, there is at least some joy to be found in there for me. I think that this has led to a long history of conservative Pokemon games. They churn out the same formula and people enjoy it. Because the reality is, as much as many will argue that Pokemon has reached an all-time low, people have been complaining about Pokemon forever. In fact, every entry post-Gen 2, people have complained that Game Freak are ruining the series. Gen 3 cut features, didn't allow you to visit previous regions, and didn't let you trade with past games. And it had too many damn trumpets. Gen 4 had an unbalanced regional dex, too many HMs, and deathly slow battles and travel. Gen 5 had weird Pokemon designs and didn't let you catch any of your old favorites, at least in the first game, and Gen 6 was too easy, with boring friendly rivals and too much dialogue. Gen 7 had an oppressively slow-moving narrative, with super linear routes, and no room to explore or get lost. People have been saying that Pokemon is dying forever, yet people always rock up and buy the new game. New generations of children fall in love with the series, and a new Pokemon craze sweeps the world every decade on a cycle. Within this context, I wouldn't blame someone for not taking any of these complaints seriously. It seems like Pokemon fans have always complained, and now in the modern internet age, we can just hear these complaints louder than before. But honestly, I do think there are some issues with the modern state of the franchise. There are a lot of people screaming into the void about what they think is wrong with Pokemon, and a giant storm of criticism and defense for the series. And I think it makes it surprisingly difficult to actually pin down what the problem is. But I'm gonna try anyway. Let's start by discussing Pokemon as a whole. There are two cursed design challenges that Pokemon has been facing since Gen 2. Scale and expectation. To begin with scale, the original game shipped with 151 original monster designs, which unsurprisingly created a technical challenge. They needed to come up with a way to allow for all of these Pokémon to battle with one another, and the solution they came up with is pretty neat. But ever since that first game, Pokémon has been a scale experiment flying out of control. Managing this huge roster presents an unbelievable technical challenge, and would serve as a massive roadblock when creating anything new. And ever since we have seen these Pokémon rendered in detailed and free-flowing animation on TV, every single fan has been dreaming of a game where battles could look like they do in the anime. Game Freak is burdened by a titanic character roster and the expectation that all Pokémon be present in each game, and on top of all of that, a wild dream for what those Pokémon could look like. I do not envy the team who has to thread that needle. For Pokémon's first 5 generations, I think Game Freak found a somewhat stable equilibrium. They released a new game with some new Pokémon, kept the national dex, and gave you a new region to explore following the already established formula. I don't mean to give the impression that these games are flawless. Diamond and Pearl in particular have some glaring quality of life issues. Slow battles, HMs, etc. But largely, these games manage to truck along pretty happily. But eventually, this reaches a breaking point. These games are good, but they aren't exactly innovative or ambitious. By Diamond and Pearl, people were complaining about the formula getting stagnant. So, things had to change. And from this point on, I think Pokémon has always been, at least, a tiny bit lost. In my view, problems start to emerge with Gen 6. Because of the previously mentioned scale problem, when Game Freak set out to make X and Y, they had both a problem and an opportunity. Making 3D assets is a lot more work-intensive than making 2D ones, but 3D assets are much more easy to reuse for future games. So, Game Freak made the massive investment to create detailed 3D models and animations for every single Pokémon in the Pokédex. This was a crucial step in future-proofing the Pokémon franchise, and the models and animations they created are pretty disappointing. With the more static 2D art, you were left to imagine these creatures, but now, rendered in complete detail, the world of Pokémon feels kind of lifeless. If the magic of Pokémon is in its world and characters, this feels like a huge disservice. We got to see the world in 3D for the first time, more detail than any previous main series game, and it's so boring. To me, this feels like the priorities got mixed up. Pokémon battles have always looked kind of simple, and I understand the technical challenges associated with making visually interesting battles, but I truly think that X and Y have very dull ideas for how to take advantage of 3D Pokémon battles. The models are flat and lack any kind of life in their animations. If these games had the exact same style, but just a little more personality in their idle movements, I think that it would make them look way more alive. And we know that that's true because people have been reanimating those. There are some excellent examples of people creating new idle animations for these Pokémon, and the difference that it makes is massive. And I feel like Game Freak knows that there's a problem here, because in X and Y, the camera spends so much time whooshing around, as though that alone will make these battles cinematic. I know that this is, all things considered, a small thing, but these battles look so boring. And tragically, because these battles look boring, almost all future Pokémon games will be cursed to have boring-looking battles, unless Game Freak makes a huge effort to overhaul these animations. The core appeal of Pokémon for me is the world, the creatures. So when the actual creature bit of this game looks so flat and dull, it's massively disappointing. Surely there is more that we can do with 3D art than to just passively imitate the 2D games? Sun and Moon do a little better. The environments in this game are really nice compared to X and Y, and having the trainers stand behind the Pokémon is a cool touch, but it's not really that big of a step up, and it doesn't really solve my core issue with these really boring idle animations. And since Sun and Moon, we haven't really had a major upgrade to how these battles look. At the bare minimum, surely we could have the exact same number of animations for each Pokémon and just give them a bit more personality. An example of this done well is Battle Revolution. Yes, this game is only focused on battles, but with a roster of over 400 Pokémon, which is around the size of the regional decks for some recent games, they brought high-quality animations and visually striking battles to the big screen. It is possible to do this better. Yes, there is much more to a Pokémon game than battles. For Battle Revolution, pretty much the entire budget could go toward these animations. But if you're going to go to the effort of creating assets that you plan to reuse in the future, why not actually make them good? The one chance that this series had to future-proof, they entirely failed. But what exactly am I supposed to ask of Game Freak here? Am I asking them to just redo it all? I mean, maybe, yeah. These assets are important to the franchise and can be reused so often that it must be worth it to make them look good. But with that said, it's probably worth noting that almost no matter what, I think we lose something in the transition from 2D to 3D. The 2D sprites have a lot of charm, and the particular stylings of 2D Pokémon, from a world design and art perspective, are great. I would love to see a new game made in this style, even though I doubt that something like that would ever happen. My other issue with modern Pokémon is the dialogue. This kind of starts with X and Y, but is almost a deal breaker for me come Sun and Moon. These games are glacial. You cannot breathe without the game shoving an NPC in your face to deliver more flat dialogue. Any charm that this world and these characters could have is entirely robbed from them because they just don't shut up. The opening segments of Sun and Moon take forever, with you being lurched around here and there, stopped for meaningless conversation and then pointed to your next location at literally every turn. Walk out of a building. Hey, you're supposed to go there. Turn a corner. Did you remember that you need to go there? All while there's already a minimap location showing you where you need to go. I get that these games are supposed to be accessible for kids, but what kid wants to read this much? It's not even hand-holding. It's fine if you want to point me toward where to go. It's more that you are never allowed to actually explore. You will experience things exactly as you are told to. You are constantly stopped and never allowed to go anywhere except for the precise location prescribed. This wouldn't be such a problem if these characters actually had interesting things to say. These passages of dialogue are accompanied with simple looping character animations, wordy text boxes, and minimal story-relevant information. No characterization either. If these games had tighter dialogue, a stronger narrative, or even just some voice acting and animation, these moments would be a lot more bearable. I like the narrative of Sun and Moon, for example, but it is honestly a pain to try to experience it. This interesting story is buried in hours of dialogue that could absolutely just be cut. There are two parts to this. It's a pace killer, and it robs the world of some of its explorative feel. The game doesn't even need to be explorative. I just kind of want to feel like it is. These games don't seem that interested in their own world. Even when they build interesting spaces, they just seem to zip you through them. You don't get to breathe and enjoy a cool new locale. There's always someone shouting in your ear. For me, I just check out. I ignore the whole story because I can't be bothered to read all that damn dialogue. Older games thrived with labyrinthine routes and side areas you could just poke your head into at your leisure. But the new games are painfully linear. There is no optional exploration, no chance to go somewhere that you're not quite supposed to yet. Even Scarlet and Violet, which is supposed to be the open-ended one, suffers from this same problem. Story sections have a horrendously slow pace, and while you do at least get to explore in between, the spaces you do get to explore are entirely charmless. Towns are bare, empty open spaces with samey buildings dotted around. Buildings which you can't even enter, which is an unbelievable tragedy in my view. Entering buildings and exploring spaces is part of what makes these worlds feel lived in. Boiling them down to their core function is just disappointing. The game isn't interested in letting you enjoy the space, it has a function. Nothing in Scarlet and Violet is built for you to explore and discover. It is all to be ticked off. Story missions to be completed, map sections to fill in, raid battles to do. It's the same problem, but just a slightly different orientation. These games are acting as though the story missions or the random tasks they have with you are the true appeal of the game. But they're not, because a shop in a Pokémon game is more than just a mechanical function, and a route is more than just a path to the next story beat. We enjoy how full these worlds feel, how well developed they are, and the idea that we would cut all of it out just for the sake of experiencing more story is just mind-boggling. To briefly address Sword and Shield, before these games were announced, there was a lot of buzz online about the potential for a Breath of the Wild Pokémon game. Several franchises had reinvented themselves on Switch. Breath of the Wild was obviously a massive event, along with Mario Odyssey, major franchises that brought us bold, visually striking, and open-ended takes on their formula. Even Fire Emblem Three Houses was a huge change, and showed us what the Switch could do with an RPG series that typically lived on handhelds. And then Sword and Shield were announced, and a lot of people were disappointed when the game was not that. This is notably not a direct flaw with the game. Yes, it didn't meet expectations, but these fan expectations weren't exactly driven by anything Game Freak themselves had promised. The game was disappointing by standards we invented. At some level, the burden for that disappointment lies on us for building up that expectation. But that doesn't give Game Freak a free pass. When we review and discuss games, we compare them to one another. While it might not be entirely reasonable to build up expectation for a Breath of the Wild style Pokémon game, I do think that it's fair for us to complain that Pokémon is falling behind other franchises. That they are failing to reinvent themselves, failing to do anything new or exciting, that the formula is growing stagnant and that fans want more. Sword and Shield is a game caught between home console expectation and handheld sensibilities. It almost would have been better if they committed to releasing a let's go scale game that lent into the opportunity provided by smaller scale. The game we got failed to capture the appeal of either, a clear product of Game Freak's indecision over what to do with the franchise. Scarlet and Violet should be the answer to this problem. The bold, open-world Pokémon game we have all been hoping for. But I think these games failed to provide the compelling reinvention we're hoping for. There's just no vision here, no idea of what this world can be. Every Pokémon fan has been dreaming of an open-world Pokémon game, one where you can find Pokémon in their natural habitat, immerse yourself in the world, and explore at your own pace. But this game does not effectively provide that experience. This world has no idea what it wants to be. It is void of points of interest and lacking any kind of visual distinction or things to do. The only things in this vast, empty expanse are Pokémon. And granted, pretty cool, but the fantasy of exploring this world, of seeing these Pokémon in their natural habitat, is left totally unrealized. There is no sense that this is an ecosystem or environment. It's just blank. In the early stages of the game, we see some more populated Pokémon habitats, places that do give you the feel of exploring the world. But then everywhere else is just a blank space with Pokémon wandering around. And the game knows that the world is boring because it lets you zip through it all. It doesn't know what to do with its scale. It doesn't know what to put there. It is world size for world size sake. Empty fields between towns. What is even the point? And then there are the gems. The game tells you that you can tackle things in any order, but all of the levels are set in advance, so you can't. There is an order, and the game just doesn't tell it to you. It trades the tightly structured pace and leveling of a linear game for a listless, dull, unfocused... You can tell that I really dislike Scarlet and Violet, right? It's a minor thing as well, but I don't really care for any gimmick introduced in a modern Pokémon game. Mega Evolution was something. The new designs are nice, but it's become clear that these are just new ways to market each game. From a strategic standpoint, it all boils down to use power-up / special move at the right time to sweep enemy Pokémon. Since Mega Evolution, I really don't feel like these systems have moved the needle for fan interest, at least for me. I feel like most of these mechanics add so little to the games themselves. I've said in this video that the mechanics of Pokémon are not really the point for me, but obviously, we still need an interesting game here. And in its current state, I do feel like there is something lacking in the battle system. Obviously, Pokémon battles have depth. There's a competitive scene and clearly something going on there. But I don't think that the games necessarily make for good RPGs. In their modern form, they're quite easy. When the games do have a bit more challenge, it can be welcome and interesting, but the ability to just grind your level up kind of undermines this. I do enjoy the base aspects of the current battle system. It's quite crunchy and there's a ton of room for small adjustments to make them more dynamic. I feel like more challenging battles that encourage some experimentation are part of the solution here. The Ultra Sun and Moon games come to mind. The totem battles were tough and usually required some sort of problem solving to beat. I'm hesitant to make these things too hard. These are kids' games after all, but I love when a battle becomes a puzzle, when you need to think about how to counter an opponent's Pokémon. I think the gimmicks that I mentioned before factor into this. I don't think that Z moves or Mega Evolution actually add any depth to the battle system. They do just give you one additional axis of decision making. When do I use my Z move? What Pokémon do I Mega Evolve? Do I Dynamax now or wait for my opponent? All these decisions do is give the air of mechanical sophistication, but they don't actually introduce that much strategy. They just make you feel like they do. It's a fairly simple way to paper over a battle system that, in its current form, feels a touch flat. I think part of the reason that I find Scarlet and Violet so disappointing is that we had an interesting proof of concept from Legends Arceus. I think that this game has a more interesting and better realized world, along with a better structure and a stronger idea for how to use its more open spaces than Scarlet and Violet. I'm not expecting the ecological realism of Monster Hunter or anything, but just the feeling of this world is slightly more grounded as a place than the one in Scarlet and Violet. Where Legends Arceus has some interesting ideas about how to structure itself, giving you motivation to explore and catch Pokemon, Scarlet and Violet tries to awkwardly retrofit the traditional Pokemon structure to an open world. There is a reason that open world RPGs typically don't let you tackle story tasks in any order. If your power changes in a substantial way over the course of the adventure, then you either need to be given the order to approach tasks in, or they need to scale them to your level. Breath of the Wild only gets away with it because it subtly leads you toward the easier option first, and even then, Link's attack power is determined by what weapon he carries, not his level. The structure of Scarlet and Violet was doomed from the start, and if you ask me, the game either had to number the gyms or abandon the structure entirely in favor of something new. The other elephant in the room with Scarlet and Violet is the game's performance. This game looks awful. It is not a complete and polished game. Even all of this time later, after several updates, it is still cursed with massive frame drops. NPC models and animations are reused so often that it truly looks like it was all hacked together at the last minute. This is indie game mentality, and it's not charming when it's coming from the major studio responsible for one of the most lucrative franchises of all time. Pokémon has a kind of magic to it. Every kid who played these games wished they could live in this world. These games are at their worst when they lose sight of that. What I want is games that realize this world in a compelling way. I don't care how they do it. 3D or 2D, open-ended or linear, as long as you get the vibes right. Giving me an open-world Pokémon game isn't fun if you squeeze all of the life out of it. More than anything else, what I want is a game that sells me on the world of Pokémon. As much as I complain, I am also an absolute sucker. I open the TCG Pocket Packs on my phone, I buy the games, usually secondhand now, as a minor act of protest. I buy the plushies, I have a flirtatious on and off relationship with Pokemon Go. Because as much as Scarlet and Violet upset me, the magic has not totally worn off. So what is it that I want out of a Pokemon game? First off, a clarification. I have complained at length about how I think Scarlet and Violet's world is dull, and how other games did have a kind of magic to them. So what am I talking about when I say this? When I think of Pokemon games that have well-realized worlds, there are 3 examples that come to mind for me. I think that Ruby and Sapphire, Black and White, and Sun and Moon are the strongest examples of well-realized Pokémon worlds. To speak specifically about Gen 3 here, I think that Hoenn has a very specific vision for what it's going for. I think that King K, in his legendary Pokémon retrospective videos, makes a solid argument for this game's world building. But, in brief, Ruby and Sapphire have a thematic vision that is reflected in the design of the world, the narrative of the game, and the Pokémon themselves. Ruby and Sapphire have an environmentalist message and are focused on its natural environments. The diversity of Hoenn's region, and yes, all that water, exist in service of this theme. Team Magma and Aqua play into this message over the course of the narrative, and even side characters like Wally, a young boy who moves to a regional area after the low air quality of his nearby city triggers a respiratory issue, play into this game's core ideas. Black and White and Sun and Moon have worlds that are similarly well realized, and are great examples of the franchise's new habit of being based on a different country with each new game. Scarlet and Violet has a rudimentary aesthetic nod to the countries that inspired it, but paints such a drab world with such uninteresting NPCs that I don't think that the character of the region comes through in any meaningful way. Team Star and the school setting don't really add much to the identity of the region, and it's so empty that it never has a chance to establish any sense of place. This world building, this focus on building a region that is worth immersing yourself in, is my primary focus for these games. I do not care what style of game they make. Try open world again, return to something more linear, whatever, just sell me on the world. Pokémon in their natural habitat, interesting locales, more exciting animations, things to see and discover. This is what I want out of a Pokémon game. In service of this goal, I also want to see these games do a better job with their writing. First off, I just think there should be less dialogue. I do not need an NPC interrupting me every 6 steps. But what dialogue is present, I also just think can be better. I think it would be cheap to say that this dialogue is childish, because there are plenty of great kids shows that have much better dialogue than this. I'm not asking for Game of Thrones, just something with some interesting ideas. Maybe some jokes that actually land, or some charming characterization. Pokémon NPCs have always had cool designs, and I'd love to see the quality of the writing match this visual presentation. I mentioned Soul Silver before, and honestly I think that Heart Gold and Soul Silver are the best overall Pokémon games that have been made so far. Having Pokémon follow you around is huge for making you feel connected to the Pokémon in your team, and the region itself just has such a strong identity. It focuses on the more mystical side of Pokémon, and just the air of mythology that hangs over the whole game. The ruins of Alph, the burnt tower, Suicune's mysterious appearances. It just makes the world feel vast and unknowable. And though relatively simple, the game has one of the stronger narratives, and one of the more interesting rival dynamics. I haven't really talked about Pokemon's mechanics in any kind of depth, which probably does bother some people. This has been a very vibes-based wish list, but my only real wish is that they do something with vision and purpose behind it. I'm a huge fan of Sun and Moon's overall structure. The totem battles and the island kahunas provide unique and compelling challenges, and you have to approach each one differently. These were leagues more interesting than gyms, in my view, and while Scarlet and Violet does imitate this somewhat, I don't think that any of the battles in that game come close to the puzzle-like totem battles in Sun and Moon, especially in the Ultra Sun and Moon games. I would love to see Pokemon return to this kind of style, but honestly, what I want most is for Pokemon to just do something that has conviction behind it. Legends Arceus and the Let's Go games made catching Pokemon exciting and rewarding by encouraging you to just run around the overworld and toss Pokeballs. They re-energized the race to fill out the Pokedex in a new and novel way. I don't actually care what Pokemon looks like mechanically, as long as it appeals to the core world of Pokemon, as long as it has a strong sense of purpose behind its design. Let's Go is perhaps the most child-oriented game in the series, but between its strong visual identity, Pokemon-filled world, and renewed focus on catching Pokemon, it might be my favorite of the Switch games. Huge call, I know. I complained briefly about the battle mechanics in the previous section, but I do want to be clear that I really like turn-based battles. I just love to see a bit more strategy involved. Maybe this looks like leaning more heavily on double battles, and introducing mechanics that allow you to build synergies within your team, or changing up how type matchups work so you don't just steamroll anything you're super effective against. And please, 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 bring back interesting spin-off games. Conquest, Ranger, Snap. It's all gone a little bit mobile gamey recently. Cafe Remix, Masters, Sleep. Give me an action RPG spin-off, a roguelike spin-off, another strategy RPG like Conquest. You could whack these guys into any genre and it would do well. Experiment. As much as I like TCG Pocket and Pokemon Go, I would sacrifice every single Pokemon mobile game spin-off just to have one good Pokemon spin-off on console. A new Ranger game, a Conquest sequel. Anything! I work in a retro video game store, and at least once a day, someone walks in and asks, "Got any Pokemon?" They are never referring to the games. What they want is the TCG, which, with the current supply levels, we sell out of instantly whenever we get them. People are fighting in the streets over these things, scalping them for absurd prices, and I cannot help but think that there is so much more money in here than there is in the games. Pokemon is the fastest working money factory in pop culture. Every few years, a massive new Pokemon trend comes around. TCG now, Pokemon Go before that. And everyone goes wild. With the merchandising efforts riding on fresh designs, Game Freak has been pumping these games out. And given their comparatively small staff size compared to other dev studios, of course they are limited with what they can do. Because these games are a logistical challenge. The number of creatures to design, animate, balance, this is a horrific experiment with scope spiraling out of control. This isn't the sole cause of my issues with Pokemon, but it is having an impact. I wish these games were more thoughtfully designed, but you don't have time to do these ideas justice when you are pumping the games out on a factory line. My issues with Pokemon rest largely on what I think these games are supposed to be. When you play Breath of the Wild, discovery is your core satisfaction. For Mario, it's the expression of the movement or the surprise of the level design. With Pokemon, I think the satisfaction is the experience of the world, the immersion these games bring, and the feel of the exciting and wonderful place that it presents with these amazing creatures. And that's quite a tricky thing to make a game around. Intricate worlds are hard work, and yes, Game Freak could step back and reevaluate what they're doing, but that would mean pushing back the next major release. Yes, theoretically, Game Freak could staff up, have multiple studios working at once, use a similar approach to something like Call of Duty to keep those games pumping out while keeping production values high. But why? Yes, maybe they'll sell a couple of million more copies, but it won't drastically change the state of play for them. It's not worth the extra cost. It isn't the savvy business move. The games will sell anyway. I hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, it's the highest grossing media franchise of all time. They can afford to make better games." But just because they could doesn't mean it's the most profitable move. Everyone knows Pokemon. It's not like better games will grow the franchise. The other side to this coin is that just because they're making the right business move doesn't mean we don't get to criticize it. I see this a lot, where people hold the commercial performance of a game up as some kind of artistic critique. Some people will even say things like, "Well, if your consumers didn't like what you did with that game, then you made a bad product." And personally, I don't think that kind of criticism belongs anywhere near games. Pokemon isn't immune to criticism because it sells well, just like something isn't bad just because it doesn't sell well. Yes, these things exist in a commercial environment, but I think it's important to separate the evaluation of art from its monetary value. And anyway, if enough of us ask for change, put pressure on Game Freak and Pokemon Company, maybe, slowly, things could change for the better. I don't think that all of the problems will disappear overnight, but I do hold out some hope that we could see improvements to the Pokemon formula. And honestly, I am holding a weird, cautious optimism for Legends ZA because, despite not looking perfect, it's ticking a few boxes for me. The different setting, increased production timeline, interesting new ideas, it's enough to get a guy interested. I do hold some hope for the series, because despite all of my whinging, I do think that Pokemon is aware of its own legacy, and aware of the fan response. Legends Arceus seems like a direct response to the whole, "We want Breath of the Wild Pokemon" that fans were saying for a while, and honestly, the games are my only true disappointment with the Pokemon franchise. Between the TCG, the plushies, the knickknacks, The merchandising folks are firing on all cylinders, and it's great. If you like buying Pokemon merch, you are well fed. In fact, most of the merchandise seems to understand that the world of Pokemon and its unique creature designs are the primary appeal. I'm seeing Pokemon picnic sets, faux sportswear, life-size plushies, all stuff that seems to buy into and sell the appeal of Pokemon as a world to be engaged with. So it's interesting to me that the games seem to have lost sight of this appeal. If the new games don't work for me, then that's fine. I can do Nuzlocke, play ROM hacks, I'll live. This, however long this video will be, is a slightly over-dramatic response to a series that I love changing. And I, and many others, will hope for better, but in the meantime, I will cheerfully play Soul Silver again. Oh no. Let's hope it hasn't moved too much.